Hello, I hope your exam went well yesterday. This is day 6, and today we're going to look at Darwin and the Evolution Revolution. I do tend to find such terms as revolution somewhat problematic when we're talking about history, let alone history of science. Yes, we talk about the scientific revolution. Yes, we talk about the Newtonian revolution. We talk about the Einsteinian or relativistic revolution, etc., and so forth. But each of these are just changes that happen during history. Some changes happen quickly and globally, others happen piecemeal and locally, spreading after that. So I think you've got to be a bit careful with terms like revolution. Nevertheless, there are two main shifts in the way people did science. One of them, of course, is Newton's physics, which set in motion a major project of what you might think of as kinetic physics, particularly in the heavens and so forth. And the other one, of course, is Darwin's view of evolution. What we're going to find, however, is that Darwin's revolution is not without its precursors, and it's not without some ways in which the prior development directly contributes to Darwin. He is not a lone genius, he is not a lost hero, he is not without his context and his milieu. So we'll be looking at this. Okay. So, in 1844, Darwin wrote to his friend Joseph Hooker, and he began to insinuate to Hooker that he no longer believed that species were immutable or fixed. That is to say, he had changed his mind from the previous view, which had been championed by Baron Cuvier in France, that species never change substantially. And he has said that it's like confessing a murder. He thinks that species are not immutable. Now, in 1844, he had written a sketch of his theory, and he'd left it with Hooker with orders that if he died before publishing his full theory, that Hooker would see to it that it was published, presumably in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society. And it eventually was, but not for that reason. All right, so there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of misunderstandings about what evolution truly is. And I think that there are a number of different senses. So the most basic sense of evolution in the context of terrestrial life is that one kind of organism can change into another kind over time. But you've got to be a little bit careful about that, because this does not mean the entire kind changes into another kind. Usually in the modern view, and to an extent in Darwin's view, it means that some part of an existing kind changes into another kind, which is another way of saying that living things have common ancestors with their nearest relatives. It's called common descent today. Now, evolution includes, in our modern view, but does not require natural selection. And if I have the time, I'll get back to what I think Darwin's 7 theories are. If not, you can see them in the PDF. They're fairly clear. But it is not, and I cannot stress this enough, it is not a march of progress. Now, the diagram that I've crossed out here is something that was published in the late 1950s, and everybody thinks of human evolution as us walking to the point where we are upright and big-headed and big-brained and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of jokes have come about since then. My neck hurts just looking at that guy on the office chair. But that's not how evolution occurs. We do not come from chimpanzees. We probably don't come from either of the two sapiens Homo species that are shown there either. Right? What we have is relationships. So the relationships shown in that first 4 steps are terminal nodes in a tree. In other words, each one of those has a common ancestor with the one that it's most closely related to. That's not progress. It's not progressive. However, to get back to history, Matthew Arnold in the period just after Darwin, like a lot of humanities educated scholars and intellectuals, claimed that Darwin's view is very, very old. It goes back to the Greeks, and Henry Fairfield Osborn published a book which you can find online if you want to read it, called From the Greeks to Darwin, An Outline of the Development of the Evolution Idea. Now, this book is bad history, and this claim of Arnold's is bad history. And the reason being that you can go back and find something that looks or sounds like almost any idea you like. People have been claiming that Plato was a Nazi, that the English Civil War included proto-Marxists and so forth. And that's just stupid. They were what they were at the time that they proposed it. And as much as I admire Lucretius, he is not an evolutionist in any sense. Okay? So there is a period in European history that starts more or less in the 9th century as theologians start to attend to the facts of the world around them more increasingly, rather than treating the natural world simply as a place to go and get moral lessons, which was a very standard view for a long time. And recently Seb Falk, I think a couple of years ago, published this book called The Light Ages, which is a demolition of the idea that the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages. There was a lot of science going on in that period, and a lot of it was surprisingly good quality. I have a couple of examples of that, but we'll get to it if we need to. Now, about the 14th century, not 16th as I've written here, about the 14th century, people started to treat the Bible more literally. That is, as a way of understanding the natural world in terms of the revelation that you get in the Bible, which was regarded as God's word and therefore without mistake, infallible. However, this set up a problem because there are certain parts of the Bible which, if taken literally, are false. One of them being the idea that the earth has corners and is flat and that the sun moves and all these sorts of things. In the 16th century, European scholars began to challenge that authority, that it was a science textbook. And Galileo famously said, the Bible teaches how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Similar claims are made about the natural world, that the Bible is not meant in order to teach us about the natural world. It's meant to teach us about God's purpose, plan and revelation, etc. So from the 16th century, the Bible ceases to be a primary source of information, and it becomes the norm in the 17th century. The beginnings of the scientific revolution starts to challenge any feasible literal interpretation of the Bible, so even quite good Christians and clergymen and so forth are finding things the Bible doesn't say. So this is, I think, the beginnings of what we might think of as evidence-based science in the European context. Here's Robert Hooke, whose wonderful book, Micrographica, is something that you should have a look at. It's got some great drawings from under the microscope. But in another context, Hooke wrote, "There have been many other species of creatures in former ages, of which we can find none at present, and that 'tis not unlikely that there may be diverse new kinds now, which have not been from the beginning." That's an absolutely radical statement in the early 18th century, but it's not new. Many people felt that there were new species, new kinds of organisms that had arisen either by divine action or by natural processes well before even the translation of the King James Bible, which was 1511, 16, I can't remember exactly. But the point being that one of the translators of the King James Bible even wrote something almost identical to this. Now, towards the end of the 18th century in France, a fellow by the name of Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, and you refer to him simply as Lamarck, held that life is created spontaneously, and there is a scale of being, a great chain of being view, but over time, something that arises as the simplest form, which he called a monad, and these are constantly being created. The earliest ones are the most high in the scale of being. So the human line, it was spontaneously arose well before any of the others, because humans are the most complex organisms. This is called Lamarckism. His mechanism for how this happened was that the features of an organism changed during their lifetime, and those changes were inherited to a degree, or a propensity to have those changes were inherited to a degree by the progeny of those creatures. So the new characteristics of the parents can be inherited by the offspring. This is sometimes called soft inheritance. It is inheritance in response to the structure of the environment in which the organisms live. So if the environment changes, the organisms will strive to do something like, in the classic case of the the giraffe, you start with a short-necked creature, and it strives to reach higher and higher leaves as all the leaves are eaten away by its competitors, and the end result is its neck is stretched a little bit. Its progeny inherit that slightly longer neck, and so on and so forth. This is iterated over time to become the giraffe that we know today. Now, a couple of things. The giraffe was a big thing about the time Lamarck had written, because one had been brought to Paris from, not quite sure whether it came via the Ottoman Empire or it came directly from North Africa, but it was so big they couldn't put it in any kind of a conveyance, so they basically led it along the roads, and people would line the streets. Thousands of people would line the streets to see this weird animal. So the giraffe has become, ever since, the standard illustration of Lamarckian evolution. Now, according to Lamarck and pretty well everybody else prior to this period, when species changed, or when new species changed, it was according to a pre-existing plan. That is to say, there was some property either interior to the animal or imposed on it from without, usually by God or physical necessity, that pushed the evolution of things in a particular direction, so that they were constantly becoming more perfect or more complex and so on. Remember, we saw that when we looked at Eric Chasson's cosmic evolution earlier. And this is basically just the great chain of being turned on its side and made temporal, right, a process rather than a static plan. Now, this explains why we call it evolution, because the term evolutio was in fact used in Latin to refer to the development of an organism. So it's like a fetus developing according to a pre-existing plan. Okay, strictly speaking, we should call it what Darwin called it, which is descent with modification, or inherited changes, or something like that. So Darwin, born the same year as Abraham Lincoln. He was an English scientist, obviously, although the term scientist had not been invented at the time he became one. He was sent to university to become a doctor in Edinburgh, and he hated the operations on living creatures, including people, and so he was sent then to Cambridge to become a clergyman. Now, in his 2 degrees, he didn't complete the medical one, he spent a lot of time under the influence of various lecturers who taught him geology, botany, zoology, and those sorts of things. There was no such thing as a major in biology in those days. So nearly everybody got their training incidentally to other things that they were studying. Darwin was so keen a naturalist that he was known as the student who was constantly with the lecturers out on field trips. When he finished, he took a place on the voyage of the HMS Beagle, which was about to go on a long trip around the world for the Royal Navy, and it was headed by Robert Fitzroy, after whom the Melbourne suburb is named, who knew of himself that he had a dark disposition and he needed somebody who was his social equal, but not reporting to him, to keep him company. Otherwise he, as many captains did in those eras, would become isolated and a bit high-handed. Fitzroy later killed himself when he was in his old age. Depression never left him. I feel very sorry for Fitzroy. As I said before, Darwin took a copy of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology with him on the Beagle, and received a second volume through the mail. Yes, they had the mail. The British mail would be sent all around on what were called packet ships, and the book caught him up, I think, in Brazil, but I'm not sure about that. And in that second volume, Charles Lyell excoriated Lamarck, just tore him to pieces, ripped him a new one. Quite unfairly, as it turned out, but very influentially in the English environment. Evolution was regarded as something that was a French revolutionary idea, and French and revolution were not 2 things you wanted to put together if you were a well-born English person at the time. Now, the voyage took quite a while, 4 years, I believe, but when he came back from his trip, he happened to read Malthus's essay on the principle of population, which was written largely as a human economics tract, and Malthus argued that it was always the case that there were more born than could possibly survive. There wasn't enough food for every organism or every human that was born, and Malthus therefore proposed that we should not try to feed everybody, but we should recognise that these are natural checks and balances on population growth. We won't go into this. It was obviously a very political text. But from it, Darwin realised that this would be true in the natural world, that more would be born than could survive. And from that, he derived the idea of the struggle for existence, which he also had encountered in the writings of Hon6 de Candolle, a botanist, who he was in correspondence with later and greatly admired. But you can find this view in lots of places. You can find it in Aristotle. You can find it all over the place. It's an obvious idea that there is a lack of harmony in birth rates versus food supplies. In 1844, this gentleman with the, I think that's a wig, it's got to be a wig, I'm not sure, Robert Chambers, who was a publisher and author. He largely wrote books about famous people and so forth, a bit of a popular author. He also was a publisher, and he was in the family that had published Chambers' Cyclopedia, and from 1861 onwards, he and his brother published what came to be known as Chambers' Encyclopedia. But he anonymously wrote a book called The Vestiges of Natural History of Creation, which presented a kind of muddled, somewhat Lamarckian, somewhat German, somewhat other French authors' view that was very, very popular for quite a while. Sold a lot of copies. A lot of people read it. And it argued that life began as a simple form, as Lamarck had, and that it became more complex over time. Now, he was not a naturalist. He did not fully understand the science he was using, and as a result, he was roundly rejected by naturalists, those who had studied it. One exception was Alfred Russel Wallace, who even once he had become an established naturalist, still thought that there was a lot to be taken from Chambers. And so let's quickly look at Alfred Russel Wallace. We've already looked at him in detail, but just to remember, he identified the Wallace line, the division between the biogeographic area of the Eurasian Old World and the Austronesian flora and fauna. He was also inspired by Malthus, which he read while recovering from malaria, and he wrote about his ideas in some detail and sent them off to Darwin in 1858. We've already talked about that. Thomas Huxley, who is uniformly and incorrectly referred to as Darwin's bulldog. This isn't a term that was ever used during his lifetime and was, I think, invented sometime in the 1930s. Don't use it. But Thomas Huxley was a surgeon who, like Darwin, got a place as the surgeon, as the voyage surgeon, on an exploratory voyage on the HMS Rattlesnake. This actually spent its time around and within the general area of Australia. So one of the places that they visited was the fort that had been set up in where Darwin is now, the city of Darwin, in one of those ironical twists, where an entire company had gone broadly insane. It wasn't something that they could easily deal with living in the Northern Territory. In the course of his voyage, he spent a fair bit of time in Sydney, met and after about 6 years married an Australian girl once he had found himself a position back in England, and she went back there. And he lectured in geology, natural history and paleontology at the London School of Mines. Remember, we talked about schools of mines being established about a century earlier or so. In a debate about Darwin's views, which was held at Cambridge, I think, he came up against a fellow called Samuel Wilberforce, who was the son of the great anti-slavery campaigner. He was a bishop, and he was pretty well opposed to any idea of evolution. Not natural selection, just evolution. He was given his scientific information by Richard Owen, who we'll look at later, but he spent a fair bit of his time in this debate ridiculing the idea of evolution and descent with modification. So Huxley famously wrote a letter to Hooker, and in that letter he said that he demolished Soapy Sam because he used to rub his hands when he was talking like this, like he was washing them. And Wilberforce had said on which side he was descended from an ape, on his father or grandfather's or grandmother's side. And Huxley replied, "If then the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man highly endowed by nature and possessed of great means of influence, and yet who employs those faculties and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into grave scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape." Now, it's probable that it wasn't actually Huxley who demolished Wilberforce, but there are no other written records to speak of. Shortly after Darwin had come up with this idea, he started to correspond with people around the world to get information. And one person that he became quite close to, although they didn't meet until after the publication of The Origin, was Asa Gray. Asa Gray had been a student of a vociferous racist and anti-evolutionist, a fellow by the name of Louis Agassiz, who'd come from Spain to Boston. And all American naturalists had to basically defer to Agassiz. Asa Gray had been his student and had been given a position by Agassiz. But he became a confidant of Darwin's, and despite his active and sincerely held Christianity, he became, as it were, a convert to Darwin's idea of descent with modification. He accepted natural selection as a mechanism, but argued that God was involved in the introduction of variation into populations so that natural selection could do its work according to God's plan. So he held that natural selection was consistent with natural theology. Darwin had no scientific explanation for novel variants in a population. We call them mutations today. That's a much later term. And Gray held that God caused this fortuitous, another word for lucky, variation on which selection acted, and argued that we know more know the reason why the progeny occasionally deviate from the parents than we do why it usually resembles them. In other words, there wasn't a good knowledge of inheritance at the time. Darwin responded, well, look, if we ascribe the end results of natural selection to God's guidance, we may as well abandon natural selection. All we need is God's guidance. And Darwin had written elsewhere that this was to basically explain nothing. Darwin argued, if we assume that each particular variation was from the beginning of all time preordained, the plasticity, that means the variability, of organisation, which leads to many injurious deviations of structure, I'll translate that, many fitness-lowering variants, as well as that redundant power of reproduction which inevitably leads to a struggle for existence and as a consequence to the natural selection or survival of the fittest, must appear to us superfluous laws of nature. On the other hand, an omnipotent and omniscient creator ordains everything and foresees everything. Thus we are brought face to face with a difficulty as insoluble as is that of free will and predestination. Darwin, that's a rather clever move by Darwin, because on the one hand he says, look, if you go with a divine explanation, you don't need laws of nature. You may as well just drop them. But on the other hand, if there is an omnipotent and omniscient creator, then, obviously everything has to happen to his plan. How does that work? And he says, in effect, and everybody would have realized this, this is a theological and philosophical problem, not a scientific one. Darwin is arguing very clearly for space for scientists, for naturalists, to discover the laws of nature and the mechanisms by which they play out. Now, in Darwin's view, he has basically two phrases that were not his that define what he thinks nature is. The first one is the struggle for existence. He gets this from Malthus and de Candolle and various other people. It's widely accepted at the time. The other is the survival of the fittest, which was written by Herbert Spencer, who was a non-scientist and a sort of philosopher come popular science writer, etc. And Spencer summarized Darwin's view as survival of the fittest, and thereby set off an argument that is still going on today about whether natural selection is a logical truth and therefore not a fact. It's a tautology, etc. and so forth. Darwin did not use the term or the phrase survival of the fittest in the first two editions of The Origin of Species, and adopted it, I believe, in the third edition, which was 1866. So, but nevertheless, the idea that more are born than can survive, and only those that are best at surviving live to pass on their traits, this is something that Darwin definitely did see nature. And it was often complained that Darwin was basically just expressing European and particularly British capitalism at the time, that nature is competitive and order falls out of the fact that all these people are doing their own thing, but all these organisms are doing their own thing, but somehow you get a balance out of it. Now, on the one hand, you can see that this is a kind of ecological view in the making. On the other, there were a number of people who thought that that was, particularly Karl Marx, thought that that was expressing the social structures of the Darwin society had into nature rather than actually reading nature. And the final thing about the struggle for existence is that it's incredibly wasteful, right? Nature is not harmonious in that everything works in a nice, efficient way. The majority of things that are born won't mature. They get eaten. They die of diseases. They die of weather. Really cold winters and really hot summers and droughts and so forth. So the idea that nature is harmonious, which had been the view in Europe pretty broadly, not always, but pretty broadly for the previous 2,000 years, was being overturned in favour of something like Hobbes's state of nature, that is nasty, poor, British and short. But the greatest mistake that Darwin made in the eyes of the theologians and the moral thinkers of the day, influencers of the day, was that he saw humans as the result of natural processes. He naturalized humans in a competitive nature. Moreover, he took seriously the Linnaean scheme, which put humans in with primates. And he believed that we evolved from apes, but what's more, that we are apes and we are animals and natural products of an unguided process. More, it was because humans were the process of a cruel and wasteful process, result of a cruel and wasteful process, I must correct that, and not the beneficent design of a loving deity who created nature for our use. So this was highly contested, not by naturalists, not by scientists, and not even by the better theologians of the day, but by the moralists largely. It was seen as something that was undercutting human dignity. And there's a famous joke from the 19th century where a well-brought-up lady mentions to her husband at the breakfast table, it says here that Mr. Darwin says that we are evolved from apes. Let us hope it is not true, my dear, but if it is, let us hope it does not become widely known. And the moral issues, the moral implications that people thought came out of Darwin's theory were also at play. He wrote to a friend, "I have received in a Manchester newspaper a rather good squib showing that I have proved might is right and that therefore Napoleon is right and every cheating tradesman is also right." This is The Guardian. So The Guardian has always had a reputation for picking the wrong side of things occasionally. Darwin took some effort to make the point that he's not saying might is right. For a start, it's not always the strongest, most powerful, or the most coercive that win out in evolution, but that he's not actually drawing moral lessons from the view of the world that he has. But nevertheless, it's always sort of hovering in the background there. I'm not sure Darwin was really able to make a distinction. Now, are humans the result of selection is a hot issue. It is going now. It is still happening now. People are arguing about this, and we'll come back to it when we talk about sociobiology. But in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, he held that human traits were either the result of natural selection or sexual selection or culture. He used the term races. It would be surprising if naturalists at that time, particularly a botanist, where botany used the term race quite extensively, but he referred to human races such as the Turkish race, the European race, the Negro race, the Amerindian race, in ways that were confused, I think. Sometimes he thought that they were biological and sometimes cultural or civilizations, but he firmly viewed human differences as biologically trivial, except that he did think that there was a sense of maturity in different races. And of course, the Europeans were the most mature of the lot, and the most undeveloped were those like the Fuegians that he encountered during the voyage of the Beagle, that they were childlike or perhaps corrupted or something like that. All right. After the origin, and he responded to this in later editions, Wallace and a fellow called W.R. Gregg argued that civilization was contrary to natural selection. It let the unfit survive to the detriment of the species. This is the origin of eugenics. Eugenics is the idea that humans have to be bred for fit variants and not simply allowed to breed and live as a burden and all this sort of stuff. It's a complex topic, and there is a subject that is taught at the university in HBS called eugenics, biopolitics, which I will be teaching this year, but is normally taught by James Bradley. And it's a complex subject, but it does end up in what we think of as the Holocaust or the Shoah, and in a number of other cases where people with disabilities have been sterilised and so forth. I think we'll talk some more about that. Darwin rejected it, but he did so in language which was a little bit opaque, leading to people thinking that Darwin was actually arguing for it. But instead, he said, we're still subject to natural selection, and we haven't stopped evolving. But he didn't really deal with that question, I think, adequately. So, what were the reactions of the churches and the religious thinkers? And it's a mixed bag. Most church authorities in most denominations, including the evangelicals, by the way, for some time after Darwin accepted descent with modification. They believed that it didn't matter where the body came from, but the soul was created in the image of God, according to Genesis, and consequently, so long as nobody made any spiritual claims about how the soul came about, it was just another scientific theory. It was something that you shouldn't argue about because, hey, we're theologians, not scientists. A number of people, like the Reverend Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts, accepted it enthusiastically. And Charles Kingsley, who was also an Anglican minister, and wrote a book called The Water Babies, which was notionally a child's book, but was really a satire on the ideas of his society. A lot of people like Lewis Carroll and the Alice in Wonderland book were satirizing things through children's literature. It was a kind of subversive thing. But Kingsley wrote to Darwin within a week of the publication of The Origin, I have gradually learnt to see that it is just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development into all forms needed pro tempore and pro loco for the time and place, as to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the lacunas, the gaps, which he himself had made. William Temple and other leading English-speaking thinkers, Catholic thinkers, also said something similar, that a God who had to fix up things along the way was not a God worth worshipping. However, In 1860, a conclave of German Catholic bishops partly rejected it. Man, as regards his body, emerged finally from the spontaneous, continuous change of imperfect nature to the more perfect, is clearly opposed to sacred scripture and to the faith. And in the 1870s, a broader Catholic conclave, which was run as a series of conferences in Holland, there was a split between those who thought that it was a scientific theory and acceptable and those who thought that it was part of the horrible modernist secular movement that was opposed to the eternal faith, etc., and so forth. So one other thing I'd like to point out, because we've got a few minutes, is that when fundamentalism, this is the American movement of Protestant Christians, they published a series of books in the 1910s and 20s called The Fundamentals, from which fundamentalism developed. And at least two writers in those books argued that Darwin was okay so long as it wasn't read to undercut the theology of the Bible. Now that's quite astonishing when you consider that every single fundamentalist today, and most evangelicals today are fundamentalists in America, is opposed to the idea of evolution. When did that happen? Well, it happened around 1960, and it didn't make a big impact until the mid-70s. So this is a very recent addition to unchanging Christian doctrine. All right, so enough snark. Let's have a quick look at the summary. So these are the ideas which Darwin is thought to have caused. The loss of the idea of purpose in nature, of there being goals, but it's not original to Darwin, and as you can see, it's not an Arcadian view of nature, but neither is it an imperial view, such as Linnaeus had said. All right, now very quickly, I want to introduce you to the 7 theories of Darwin and Wallace. This is not what you will find in most of the textbooks. It is, I think, a much better view of things. If you read Ernst Mayr, you will get different list of Darwin's theories, and then largely set up to provide him with a hook to hang his own ideas on. So here are the 7 main theories. Transmutation, or descent with modification. Common descent, which is not held by all evolutionists either before or after Darwin, that species with similar structures were similar because they descended from a common ancestor. The struggle for existence, more organisms are born than can survive, and that the competition for natural selection here is against the environment rather than necessarily other things in the species. Natural selection, that things naturally spread over a distribution curve, and variants which happen to be more advantageous to its organisms and which happen to be heritable will reproduce more frequently and change the species overall, or the population is probably a better way to do it. Sexual selection, this is unique to Darwin, that one or the other gender has the choice of mating in animals, and that they will go for things which are arbitrary, and they will become exaggerated. For instance, the peacock's tail or the tails of birds of paradise, they can barely fly with those tails. So it's clearly fitness reducing, but it's fitness enhancing because it means they get more mates and have more progeny. Darwin and Wallace were also concerned to look at the dispersal and the place in which the organisms lived. That's the biogeographic stuff that I talked about. Wallace is probably more influential than Darwin, but Darwin certainly had talked about this. And finally, Darwin's very bad idea about genetics. He called it pangenesis, and the idea was that every cell, every tissue shed these particles which found their way to the gonads, and the more that they were used, the more they were sent to the gonads, and therefore inherited by the next generation. So this was called pangenesis, and it is a form of soft inheritance that leads many people to think Darwin was a Lamarckian, but it's not quite as clear-cut as that. Its only lasting influence is that the term gene comes from pangene, so the terminology by which we know genetics is Darwin's, even if the ideas were originally Mendel's. Okay, now I'm going to leave this lecture here. What we're going to look at next, after the break, is human origins and the origins of life. Thank you. Okay, second lecture. So what we have here is the question of in what way humans are related to the rest of nature, and also the question that's sometimes raised about the evolutionary theory is what was the origin of life? And I'd like to consider both of these. So, in the century or so before Darwin, we get a number of people speculating on human connections with apes. The Great Chain of Being had held that there was a scale or a ladder which statically existed, that humans were not from apes, but they were a little bit above apes. And that, or to put it better, apes were a little bit below humans. But Rousseau speculates that possibly apes are a kind of undeveloped human, particularly orangutans, which was what the Europeans knew at the time. And he speculated that they might be a race of genuine wild men dispersed in the woods in ancient times without the possibility of developing any of its virtual faculties, without having acquired any degree of perfection, still living in the primitive state of nature. Now, this is in the context of a political debate. The question was, is civilization either good or bad? And of course, we know which side Rousseau comes out on. But nevertheless, there were people who argued strongly. The Scot Lord Monboddo, in addition to Rousseau, had felt that apes were, as it were, humans in potentia, that is, possibly able to become human. And this is part of an old trope about wild men, about savages and so forth, that goes back some distance in the Western view. In 1859, Lyell wrote to Huxley, where, among other things, he thought that he'd been too hard on Lamarck, but he said, "I conceive that Lamarck was the first to bring it forward systematically and to, quote, go the whole orang." Now, this is an English expression, going the whole hog, and it means for Lyell carrying evolutionary thinking to its full conclusion and linking human beings to animal ancestors. Darwin didn't do that. What he said was that he thought light would be shed upon human beings in the future. very careful in the origin not to say anything about people, and there's good reason for that. People are very sensitive to this sort of thing. So in his great evolutionary proposal, the Philosophique Zoologique, Lamarck proposed that humans arose through transmutation from an ape, from an orangutan, it was a generic term for ape, and that was its sort of previous state of being. Okay. Now, that's not an unreasonable thing given his theory, but Lyell believed in the 1830s this was absurd and devoted 2 chapters of his Principles of Geology to attacking and refuting the Lamarckian view. And to his credit, when he wrote to Darwin, when I came to the conclusion that after all Lamarck was going to be shown to be right, and that we must go the whole orang again, I reread his book, and remembering when it was written, I felt I had done him injustice. In France, Lyell's attack and Cuvier's attack didn't really stop evolutionists from thinking that Lamarck had been broadly correct. And as late as the 1950s, Darwin was not really taught in France to students. It was, and when he was, it was through a Lamarckian lens. Now, earlier, before the origin, in 1838, Darwin encountered a couple of young orangutans, Tommy and Jenny, at the London Zoo. This was a couple of years after the voyage in the Beagle, and Darwin, as a corresponding member of the zoo, was allowed to visit and experiment with the animals. And he spent a fair bit of time with Jenny, quite impressed by her human-like ways. So he writes to his sister Susan, his older sister. Remember, Darwin is the youngest of the tribe, the Darwin tribe. I saw the orangutan in great perfection. The keeper showed her an apple, but would not give it her. Whereupon she threw herself on her back, kicked and cried precisely like a naughty child. She then looked very sulky, and after 2 or 3 fits of passion, the keeper said, "Jenny, if you will stop bawling and be a good girl, I will give you the apple." She certainly understood every word of this, and though like a child she had great work to stop whining, she at last succeeded and then got the apple, which she then jumped into an armchair and began eating with the most contented countenance imaginable. He spent a lot of time comparing the emotional and behavioural aspects of Jenny, and to a lesser extent Tommy, effectively at this point starts the discipline of comparative psychology, but he didn't develop it in great detail. So, people who had argued that humans and primates are linked evolutionarily, we've got a bunch of people here. I've spoken about most of them. Notice that Tom Huxley wrote Man's Place in Nature in 1863, which is 8 years in advance of Darwin's own book on the subject, The Descent of Man. Darwin was not entirely happy with Huxley's book because Huxley didn't give much play to natural selection. He never really was fully convinced of it, I think, as a main agent of evolutionary change. And this is something I found on in the conversation, which is, I think, a good summary of how we see these things. If you're very lucky, you might have seen an orangutan in the wild. Most people have only seen them on television. In either case, the animal was probably deep in some remote forest, as yet untainted by people. This is the image that we associate with these critically endangered animals, vulnerable, dependent on pristine habits, and incapable of coexisting with people. But that view may be wrong. Until recently, our ideas about conservation were constrained by the romantic notions of wild nature and our limited grasp of just how adaptable and robust nature can be. Yet understanding how prolonged exposure to humans has impacted even well-studied species can help overturn assumptions about them and make conservation more effective. The orangutan is a good example. And what's being referred to there is the fact that as the orangutans have been forced into more and more marginal habitats, largely by the clearing of forests in order to grow palms for palm oil, which I think is a horrible thing, but that's me. They've started to coexist with human beings, as have many animals in similar situations, such as coyotes in America, or foxes in England, and so on and so forth. Or what are they called? Trash pandas. What are they called? The American raccoons. That now live largely on their ability to open and eat human garbage and so on. This urbanisation is a very interesting effect, and I think worth looking into. Now, from this, I would like to turn to the origin and nature of life. This is not going to be a long section, and there'll be plenty of time to discuss this. But one of the continual objections to evolutionary theory is it cannot account for the origin of life. Now, this is partly true, but then astrophysics cannot account for the origin of the bodies that it describes, their mechanics. Because it can't account, astrophysics purely cannot account for the origins of the materials of which planetary bodies are made. But that doesn't make it less a good theory. And I think that there's a bit of confusion here. The theory of evolution is not a theory of the origin of life. That said, some people have argued that the origin of life has to be an evolutionary process, but it's problematic because there are no genes, by definition, in the origin of life. And so people have proposed a number of different theories, which I'll look at in a minute. Historically speaking, the idea that life arose naturally was something that was in Lucretius and Epicurus, and also in Epictetus and a bunch of other early Greek philosophers, generally because the gods had endowed the earth with the power to naturally create these things. And this was called spontaneous generation. In Latin, I can't remember the Latin for it, but it was a standard view among those who were not, strictly speaking, special creationists. That is, they did not say that God had created each species. In the late 18th, early 19th century, people were starting to argue that life could arise chemically, that there was a chemical process that would allow this to happen. Here is a physician, a natural philosopher, a poet of sorts, a slave trade abolitionist, and, as it happens, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who published a long epic poem in the Greek form, The Temple of Nature, which was a big sensation at the time and completely forgotten within 10 or 15 years. But he has a passage I mean, among other things, he anticipates natural selection, which is not surprising. Natural selection was something that many people talked about. But here is a passage. I'm going to read it because it's almost Vogon-like poetry. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. Not exactly how you would present a scientific theory today, but he was one of a number of people, and arguably he preempted Lamarck in this. So in his poem, with I think with some prose commentary, he presents the view that life could have arisen, organic life could have arisen in the sea, and from that point on they would evolve into more and more complex organisms. Darwin denied that he got any of his ideas from his grandfather, and that's probably broadly correct. But many of the people who influenced him on evolution got their ideas from his grandfather. So it's a matter of dispute and debate. I don't think he owes very much to his grandfather, but I think the fact that it was in the air when he was young couldn't have hurt. Now, in a letter to Hooker in 1871, he proposed what is now referred to as Darwin's warm little pond, where he said, in the context of a much larger letter, "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present which could ever have been present. But if, and oh what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity and such present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes, at the present day such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed." So what he's basically saying there is that first of all, the first production of life was chemical. Secondly, that the reason we don't see it happening today is because if these things do spontaneously arise, proteins and so forth, they're food for what is now much more complex. But it wouldn't have been the case back then, and so therefore life could have been chemically evolved. Now, this was never published in his lifetime, and it was published in his letters edited by his son Francis later in the century and read by a number of people, and this led to a whole tradition of interpreting the origins of life in terms of chemical evolution. One of the most interesting was V.I. Oparin, who was a chemist, biochemist, I think, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, who wrote a book in Russian, which was published and was later translated into English in the 1930s. Other people who accepted that view included J.B.S. Haldane, a number of others, and although there wasn't much in the way of experimental work because people didn't know what experiments to do, there was a lot of speculation about what the origin of life might have been. Now, in 1958, a young doctoral student named Stanley Miller, who was doing his doctorate with Harold Urey at Stanford, I believe, he put together an experiment where he would boil water, he would add mixtures of methane, ammonia salts, hydrogen, and so on, and then pass it through a chamber where sparks were being created. Put it into a condenser and bring it out of the system, and he ended up with a mixture of organic compounds. They were quite complex compounds. Recycle the water and just keep doing it, and the end result was that he created many of the building blocks of proteins. Now, what wasn't appreciated at the time was that the glass surface of the containers acted as a catalyst for these reactions. And one of the theories that are around today is the notion that early life actually got catalyzed on silicate substrates, such as clays, and that mineral surfaces act as catalysts for complex chemical reactions. And Robert Hazen, one of the biologists working in this, he says, we see intertwined co-evolution of the geosphere and the biosphere. Life begets rock, and rocks beget life. In case that seems a bit strange to you, most clays today are the result of decomposition of organic materials. So they're highly organic. But the clays at the time of the origin of life, which must have happened within about 500,000 years of the ocean's cooling, because we see signatures in the fossil records and the geological record, that obviously the clays were not organic. And we've, since that time, which was around 3.9 billion years ago, we've got sedimentation based on living organisms, and so forth. The Earth as it stands today geologically is heavily influenced by its life. There's a couple of links there that you'll be able to get to, but what I want to show you now is a New Scientist video on the origins of life. It's a little bit cheesy at the beginning. I do apologize for that. So let's see how we go. Okay, see if I can get it going. Yes, no, yes.
It's alive! How are you meant to do it? In 1953, graduate student named Stanley Miller mixed 4 simple chemicals, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water, heated them up, and shocked them with electricity to mimic lightning. He hoped the results would be the key to unlocking the origins of life, but almost 70 years on from the experiment, we still don't have the answer. Figuring it out is going to take some serious detective work. Even the timing is uncertain. All we know for sure is that life began sometime between the formation of Earth 4.5 billion years ago and the oldest fossils 3.4 billion years ago. That leaves a window of 1.1 billion years. Some people think life could have come to Earth from somewhere else in space, a concept with the slightly off-putting name of panspermia. The idea is that life could have come to Earth from another planet on a meteoroid, somehow surviving the harsh environment of space and the crash landing to begin our evolution. But that doesn't seem very credible, because we have no evidence for life anywhere else in the cosmos, and it still doesn't help us answer the fundamental question of how life arose in the first place. Darwin wondered if life began in a warm little pond, but the first serious theory about the origin of life was called the primordial soup. Scientists thought when Earth was young, the oceans were filled with the chemicals needed for life, and they eventually assembled themselves into simple living cells. Then came Stanley Miller's experiment, and while it didn't create life itself, it did produce amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. Further experiments showed that amino acids could join together to form proteins when they're heated up. Proteins perform a lot of essential functions in living organisms, like acting as enzymes that speed up chemical reactions. But the idea that proteins started life on their own has now been largely rejected. Life has to be able to reproduce, and that means you need molecules that can copy themselves. The strongest candidate is RNA. RNA is a similar chemical to DNA, but it can also fold up and act as an enzyme, just like a protein. RNA is not as good as DNA at storing information, and it's not as versatile as proteins, but it's a bit of a molecular jack of all trades. So it seems more likely that the first life forms were based on RNA, and that DNA and proteins came later. The trouble is, in the lab we find that RNA needs a lot of help to assemble or copy itself. So chances are, it wasn't enough to start life on its own. As far as we know, life can't exist as chemicals in a soup. All the living things we know about are made of cells that package up the chemicals. Some scientists reckon that the first organisms were made of oil droplets or bubbles that acted like primitive cells, providing the structure for life to get going. In the lab, we can create droplets that show lifelike behavior, sensing and responding to their neighbors and moving towards food sources, a bit like Pac-Man. Crucially though, these droplets can't replicate or evolve, meaning it's unlikely that this guy was your ancient ancestor. Finally, it's been suggested that life began with chemical reactions that extracted energy from the environment and used that energy to build the molecules of life. In other words, metabolism came first. This might have happened in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, where energy from inside Earth heats the water up to 400 degrees. So which came first, cells, metabolism, or genetics? It's a bit of a chicken and egg conundrum. When any of these theories are tested out in the lab, none of them produce anything remotely lifelike. The alternative is that life arose fully formed, with all of these elements in place right at the start. That might seem even more unlikely, but recent evidence has led some scientists to think that's exactly what happened. The chemistry required involves ultraviolet light and periodic drying, so the most likely location for this is thought to be chemical-rich pools on land. You can read more about that idea in New Scientist. If you'd like to subscribe, I'll give you 20% off if you use the code SAM20. So the origin of life is still shrouded in mystery. Scientists have tried all sorts of experiments to recreate life. They haven't gone all the way yet, but we made a lot of progress. Maybe one day soon we'll succeed in creating artificial life in the lab, which could tell us how our oldest ancestor came to be. What could possibly go wrong?
Stop. Stop. All right. Okay, well, we'll stop that there. Sorry about the cheesy intro and outro. So one of the things that has been happening since Miller's experiment is that people have started to look at chemical reaction cycles. Sam, whoever he is, mentioned repeated drying and what have you. But in the 1970s, a physicist by the name of Manfred von Eigen, or just Eigen, proposed what he called the hypercycle. And this is where you have chemicals that undergo a reaction, generate a product, which then undergoes a reaction, which generates a product, and so forth, and then creates the first molecule in the chain. So you get this, it's a form of reproduction. It's a cycle that generates more and more copies of various molecules. So it's thought that the first living organism was a hypercycle. Not all hypercycles are alive, but it could be that all living things started as a hypercycle. Now, the question of inheritance, I think there's a strong tendency to look at what's going on today in order to define what is life, which has been taken up a little bit too enthusiastically by NASA, in my view. The idea that in order to find life, we've got to find something that uses the same chemical reactions that are in terrestrial life, as if that was a universal in the universe. However, I don't see why that's necessarily the case. We know that chemistry, particularly biochemistry, is incredibly complex, and there are multiple pathways by which these could have been achieved. Even if we do end up creating life in the laboratory for some definition of life, it's not likely to share exactly the chemical processes that we use today. And the other question is, where do genes come from? Because it appears that you need some sort of selection process to weed out the less well-performing hypercycles. And if there's no inheritance, then there can't be evolution. And I think that's based on a mistake that inheritance is always and only an exact informational process. I think that more efficient hypercycles will outcompete less efficient hypercycles when there are limited resources. They might even absorb the materials from less efficient hypercycles in order to generate themselves. And the genes themselves can evolve through a process of selection. But this is all an open subject, and what's most interesting about it from my perspective is that it's not that there are no ways in which we can see how proto-life and then the last common ancestor could have evolved. It's that there are too many possible ways that could do it. And if we haven't been able to recreate life, it's possible we just haven't found one of those possible ways yet. Remember, he said there's 1.1 billion years to play with. My feeling is that as soon as the oceans cooled, we started to get these sorts of processes, and I would think that within 0.5 to 4 million years, we've got life. A very, very simple life, maybe chemical life rather than the more complex stuff that we see today. And in 1.1 billion years, a lot can happen. So I think that life is pretty much as old as the conditions under which it could have arisen. And that if we can't do it, it's because we haven't had 500,000 years yet to fiddle with it. I'm sure we'll take less time to do that. So if we don't expect the same chemistry on Enceladus or Mars or some other body in the solar system, why is it that we test only for the things that are signs of life on Earth, such as methane production and the like? And the answer is because that's all we know. We have a sample set of 1. And if we find something that does reproduce and does meet the hypercycle definition, I would have no hesitation calling it life, even if it doesn't look like anything that would happen on Earth. All right, thank you very much. Let's talk about all of this, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far.